Okay, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kesha Rogers, and I want to welcome you to today's discussion. Um, and the title of our discussion today is going to be Putin's Sputnik shock. This is not the beginning of a new arms race. This is the end of it. The speaker, our main speaker for today, is going to be Joel DeJean. But what I wanted to do is, as many of you know, as a representative and leader of the LaRouche organization, I am also running for Congress as an independent here in the 9th Congressional District, campaigning on the LaRouche platform to win the future around the implementation of LaRouche's 4 economic laws for recovery. And what I want to do today is my presentation is going to be short because I want to really get to the moment we're in of opportunity, that of the shifting period that's happening throughout the world right now, the shifting tides throughout the world. And I think to look at the opportunity that has presented itself, you have to step outside of the local politics and really look at this moment from the standpoint of what Helga Zepp-LaRouche has been calling for, that we're now at a moment where the end of geopolitics, the end of a unipolar world system, the end of a system that seeks to keep some nations backwards and underdeveloped, that seeks to continue to push for the threat of annihilation through war and economic collapse and depression. That system is now coming to an end. And what you have is a true emergence of a new paradigm based on an ecumenical mutual understanding of mankind. Now, some people may not see it that way or may not even want you to actually know about what is really the intention behind the developments toward cooperation that's going on. You take, as people are seeing, we'll start from the top, that the recent announcement by President Trump that he is now has accepted an offer by the North Korean leader, Kim Jong-un, to meet by the end of May, before the end of May. I mean, this is a major breaking development. And it's also coming in the aftermath of what has become a real earth-shaking speech given by the president of Russia, President Putin, just in terms of his March 1st State of the Union address, where in essence, in that speech, the president of Russia announced the development of a new system of ballistic missile systems, and a new system of what Helga Zepp-LaRouche referred to in her recent statement as what has been a new powered missile systems for making nuclear weapons obsolete. But let me get back to that in just a second. I think the reality of what we're looking at right now is that, as the statement that was made by the Russian President Putin underscored, that there's a new shift going on in the world right now to bring about the end of the threat of nuclear war, by saying that the moment of opportunity that has presented itself is a moment to bring about a collaboration in new shared principles of scientific technology, to address the needs of all mankind, to put an end to the threat of war, but to actually bring about solutions that face us commonly. Solutions such as ending poverty, what the Chinese have committed to and have actually achieved to a certain extent, of lifting over 700 million people out of poverty. What has now been stated in the recent remarks by the Russian president, that Russia has now lifted over half of its population out of poverty. Now, this has to be the commitment of the United States, because as we're seeing right now, that the United States has an opportunity to actually break with this system of geopolitics and join with the emerging new paradigm. And any political leader who is running for political office should really see this as this moment of opportunity. And this is why, at the very time where you have this shift going on, what we're going out to do with my campaign and with leadership throughout the LaRouche organization, organizing potential candidates, current political leaders, international leaders, that the solution to the current threat of a unipolar world system and the current threat of war is immediately outlined in this fight for the new paradigm, bringing the United States on board the Belt and Road Initiative, but also recognizing that we have to return to a real principle of mutual understanding and economic development for this nation and for all nations, which have really been outlined in LaRouche's 4 laws. So what the topic of our discussion is going to be today is to look at what has just transpired in the recent report and speech that was given by the president of Russia. And you take this recent speech that he gave on March 1st, and the response to it is quite all over the place by many leaders in terms of continuing to push the idea that the threat to the United States is coming from China, is coming from Russia. And the threat, that's not where the threat is coming from. The threat for decades has been coming from a geopolitical unipolar world system that says that a win-win strategy is not possible, that there are winners and that there are losers. And that in that condition, the only way that one nation is going to dominate over another nation is to look out for the interest of that individual nation and not for the interest of all nations as a whole. And this was absolutely contrary and has been contrary to true leaders in society, such as Lyndon LaRouche, and really what you see being complemented by what the Russian president just announced, as that true leaders in society are not looking for ways in which one nation is going to dominate nuclear power and control over another nation, but how these new scientific principles, shared technologies, are going to be in the advancement and interest of all nations. And this is the response that you've been getting to this from some of the British establishment and those who want to continue to push the threat of war, is to the extent of complete denial of the fact that the systems, new systems of scientific progress, of which Putin announced, as he announced that the Russian forces had acquired weapons based on new physical principles, including a new avant-garde intercontinental ballistic missile capability of moving 20 times the speed of sound and having the excellent maneuverability. I don't know if people had a chance to see this. It says it can therefore outmaneuver all existing air defense and missile defense systems and render them obsolete. Now, what this may remind people of, and what it sounds like, is what was in motion back over 30 years ago, and was announced just on March 23rd by President Reagan, of the Strategic Defense Initiative to make nuclear weapons obsolete. Now, as Helga LaRouche in her recent statement indicated, that this was the objective of Lyndon, and this was the platform of Lyndon LaRouche, that he actually was organizing as a back channel negotiator of the Reagan administration at that time. This was not just a end of mutually assured destruction, and this was not just the making of nuclear weapons obsolete, but this was taking it a step further in the way that the Russians have actually indicated now, that these new scientific principles are to actually call to the negotiating table a new standard of communication, a new standard of cooperation among nations, because as Joel is going to go through, what we're talking about is not weapons that are going to be used to annihilate each other, but as President John F. Kennedy understood, that we're going to be building weapons of understanding, meaning that you would actually be able to take the new technologies, the new scientific principles, and apply them to address what it is that is a common threat to all of mankind. The common threat to all of mankind coming from space, from the idea of asteroid defense, scientific cooperation amongst nations. And as we've seen, if we think about what we've been able to accomplish over the years in our cooperation with Russia through the collaboration in space cooperation and the space program. I mean, this has been very important to stifling off the threat of war already. And this has been the intention, and it continues to be the intention, as we're seeing right now, that many people are both denying the existence of the capabilities that the Russians have laid out, and secondly, are treating this as a new Cold War scenario, instead of looking at it from the standpoint that we have to eliminate once and for all this threat of annihilation and of war. And so, as this new statement has come out, what you see is that you have a number of different responses that are happening to this. Now, just with reference two of them, which make the point, and then go back to the response of our organization in addressing what this really means for the shift that's happening in the world. First of all, in the Nation magazine, and outlining an interview that was done by Stephen Cohen. This is called "How Washington Provoked and Perhaps Lost a New Nuclear Arms Race," subtitled "Putin Declares That the Long U.S. Attempt to Gain Nuclear Superiority Over Russia Has Failed and Hopes Washington Will Listen Now." The second article in response to this has been, and I'll go through this, has been "Experts Aghast at Russian Claim of Nuclear-Powered Missile with Unlimited Range." This was in NPR, and also they take from one of the top Russian blogs, and quote a research specialist on Russia by the name of Edward Geis. But the key thing that is coming up right now is the question of a number of people continuing to look at the situation that has now been presented as not an opportunity for moving toward cooperation, but to say that, again, this is a new arms race. And it's completely insane, because what we're seeing right now is that, as the Russian president made clear, their intention is not to actually start a nuclear confrontation and war. It's the opposite. And that has to be the intention of the United States. And I think that for many decades now, people have been living in fear and have been living under this threat that has been initiated by the forces of the geopolitical worldview, that if you just keep people at odds with each other, if you keep nations at odds with each other, if you continue to push the idea that one nation has to be dominant over the other, or that nations that possess nuclear weapons, that they always have to be in a face-off against each other. This now has to come to an end, because the reality is, many of these analysts are making the point clear that what the Russians have just announced has just made any attempt to subvert or to actually continue to push them to the edge of war is not going to be in the interest of anyone. Including the fact that for decades, for years now, we have continued to put ballistic missile systems at the border of Russia. For years now, we have continued to push policies of war and economic collapse, which has been the basis of what has been the condition of the people of the United States right now. While we are not handling the needs of our economic needs, we're sending more and more people out to these needless, unconstitutional wars. And instead of saying, we're going to actually cooperate for the mutual benefit of the people of this nation and the people of the world, this is what we've actually come to. So now you look at the response that we're getting, both from the President of the United States, and why the escalation of the witch hunt and coup against the President of the United States is continuing to grow, despite the fact that those who are pushing that are being exposed as complete criminals and frauds, as we've continued to go out and expose the fraud, or expose the crimes of Robert Mueller, the special prosecutor that has been put in charge of the attacks and investigation of the so-called Russian meddling in the U.S. election. And I will just make this point that if people have not seen this or heard about it, there is now a 6-part series done with an interview by Megyn Kelly and President Vladimir Putin called Confronting Putin, where these people have still not learned their lesson. The main objective of this is to continue to say, I don't care what you say, Russia meddled in our elections, and at the same time, and to basically try to box in unsuccessfully the Russian president, to make him try to try and make him admit that he had something to do with the 13 Russian operatives that were charged by the current charged by Mueller, that he had something to do with their relationships or supposed relationships in the meddling of U.S. elections. So this is the type of thing that is bombarding the U.S. public right now. This is a type of thing. This thing it's a 6-part series. It almost, the way that the Russian president actually handles it is really a calm and resolute. The intention of the Russians right now, the intention of that presidency, again, is they're concerned about the well-being of their nation, well-being of the economic progress, lifting people out of poverty. And this was the number one thing that was actually made clear, which people avoid or actually avert responding to, is what was it that was actually said in the context of actually delivering this message of these new scientific systems that was laid out. Well, at the end of that very speech, the Russian president said, "Let us sit down at the negotiating table and work together to design a new and relevant system of international security and sustainable development for all of human civilization." And this goes completely against what has been the order of operations for a very long time, just as the development of this new paradigm of the Belt and Road Initiative, the New Silk Road, the commitment to a mutual understanding of a shared and common destiny for mankind that's been laid out by the Chinese President Putin has been, Chinese President Xi Jinping, thank you. The Chinese President Xi has been laid out that this commitment for a new system of mutual cooperation, which is based on win-win relation amongst nations. Now, the problem is that has to be both the external among nations, and it has to be the internal within nations, that in order to solve the conflicts confronting us internally, this is going to be putting an end to the internal strife of the idea that some people deserve to live in poverty while others deserve to live in luxury. And you have a system that keeps people at odds with each other. And this is what my campaign is committed to, that as we look at this larger picture of the shift that's happening around the world, we also have to look at the fact that what is it that our leaders are doing right now to address the reality of this crisis, to address the fact that the solutions that are outlined in the United States by the platform that I've laid out, the platform that has been put forth by the policies of Lyndon LaRouche, are what is absolutely at the forefront of what's needed for cooperation and development around the world. Now, this just gets me to, I wanted to just bring up again what it is that has to be the response to this new world emerging system of mutual cooperation, and how Lyndon LaRouche has laid out what has to be the basis of that response. Give me a second here. Lost my. And I just wanted to read this because it's really beautiful, really powerful. I really would recommend people to go back, and this is actually in the recent Executive Intelligence Review magazine. If you're not a subscriber to the Executive Intelligence Review, I would, this is what the publication looks like. I would really encourage you to do so. And you can get weekly updates on the strategic overview of what's happening throughout the world. But I think, as I read to you the statement before, in terms of what the real intention that has been outlined by both the Chinese and the Russian president to actually sit down at the negotiating table, this is exactly what has been and what has been the intention of Lyndon LaRouche, as he laid out many years ago and continues to lay out the same vision of what was then called the LaRouche Doctrine, published in published on March 30th of 1984. And he calls out a strategy for peace, which is really at the forefront of the Belt and Road Initiative, which is at the forefront of this new development for negotiations through new scientific principles and technology that the Russian president has now laid out, and really which is at the forefront of what has now transpired with the potential of negotiations and cooperation of the President Trump announcing that he is going to be meeting with the North Korean President Kim Jong-un. That the key to all of this is what LaRouche has laid out for 30 years is economic cooperation, scientific progress for all, technological progress for all, and peace through development. And so just in the opening paragraph of this draft memorandum of an agreement between the U.S. and USSR at the time that he wrote, which is absolutely relevant for today, he titles the first portion of his document General Conditions for Peace, which state the political foundation of durable peace must be A, the unconditional sovereignty of each and all nation states, and B, cooperation among sovereign nation states to the effect of promoting unlimited opportunities to participate in the benefits of technological progress to the mutual benefit of each and all. The most crucial feature of the present implementation of such a policy of durable peace is a foundation, the most crucial feature of present implementation of such a policy of durable peace is a profound change in the monetary, economic, and political relations between the dominant powers of those relatively subordinate nations, often classed as developing nations. Unless the inequalities lingering in the aftermath of modern colonialism are progressively remedied, there can be no durable peace on this planet. And that is, I think that's worth thinking about right now, because as Joel comes up and gives us the breakdown of what these new scientific principles that the Russians have actually, in the Russian President Vladimir Putin's speech, has actually outlined, I think we have to look at this from the standpoint of this is the question before all of us right now. How do you actually sustain a durable and lasting peace amongst nations? What is it going to take to sustain that same durable and lasting peace for solving the conditions of the world that keep people in poverty. And as we look at next month, we're now going to be heading into the 50th anniversary of the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King. And this was what his fight was really about. The question of solving the problems of inequality, solving the problems of racial inequalities, economic inequalities, was only going to be and be done through a higher conception of creating a peace amongst mankind, amongst nations of the world, that solving the problem of economic disparities meant that also you couldn't send people into needless wars, to ending wars and actually addressing the threat of poverty by saying, again, that poverty has no place in our day and age. So as we're looking at this threat of war, the ending of the threat of war has to also be accompanied by a commitment to ending poverty and creating a peace amongst nations. And this has to be the commitment of all leaders. And so as I end here and bring Joel up, I wanted to just, read this final quote that comes from Dr. King's Riverside speech called the Time for Silence, and in the ending of the Vietnam War. Says, a genuine revolution of values means in the final analysis that our loyalties must become ecumenical rather than sectional. Every nation must now develop an overriding loyalty to mankind as a whole in order to preserve the best in their individual societies. This call for a worldwide fellowship that lifts neighborly concerns beyond one's tribe, race, class, and nation is in reality a call for an all-embracing and unconditional love for all of mankind. So I think that that's the moment we're in right now, to think about what is actually transpiring in the world. You have to rid your mind of the noise, of the negativity, and think about what it is that we're actually out to create for the future. And I think our campaign platform, Campaign to Win the Future, is the most vital and profound platform that can be put forth right now, because that's where we are at this moment. And I would just end by just giving people a sense, as we're going out and the campaign, my campaign here in the 9th Congressional District is continuing to escalate. We have a fight on our hands. Let me tell you that, I was just received a tweet from that was sent out by the current Congressman Al Green. And you think about the response that I'm giving now to that, the moment of opportunity is that we can actually avert the threat of nuclear annihilation and war. We can cooperate with nations. And the first thing that he said in response to President Trump indicating that he is willing and plans on going to meet with the North Korean leader, Kim Jong-un, was that this is going to be good for the North Koreans, bad for the United States, because it's going to give North Korea power and legitimacy and the North Korean president and the North Koreans. Despite the fact that the North Koreans have made the point that the conditions of this meeting are to actually negotiate on their willingness to abolish or their nuclear weapons, and also that this is the first time that such a negotiation of the type has happened. Now, to just say that it's outright not going to work, I mean, this is the person who has been calling for the president's impeachment based on no evidence, no offenses whatsoever. But I think that this is a dangerous situation when you have a moment right now where the opportunity to stop any type of confrontation that could lead to a war of annihilation is presented. Any thinking leader would say, actually back that opportunity, take that opportunity. Now, we don't know exactly what's going to happen, but we do know that this is a time right now for political leaders not to play partisan political games. This is a time for people to actually come together and say, we have a mission before us to put an end to this decades-long policy of war and policy of geopolitical strife amongst nations, and actually come together at the negotiating table again. And I think that this is why my campaign is so critical right now. And each and every one of you who are in here, I'm asking you to get involved. I'm asking you to go out with us, to talk with people, to get people to rationalize about what it is that's at stake for not just the 9th district, but for the nation and for the world. And if we actually solve these problems and we address it from this higher standpoint, then we're going to be able to address, what it is that's confronting people at even a lower level right now, because the fight is the same. The poverty and the collapse on one side is the same as what's happening with the conditions on another side. So I will just say, before I turn it over to Joe, that we want to get people active in our full-fledged campaign. We have a activity sheet that we made up here for the campaign, and also it gives you a sense of what we're going to be doing, going door to door, organizing. Let me just say this for new people in the room who don't know this, who as a independent candidate for Congress, I'm petitioning to get on the election ballot, and I'm required to have 500 petition signatures, and in order to actually secure a place on the ballot for the general election. And I need everyone to actually back us up in that, to sign up, to let me know what days, evenings, weekends, nights you have available to go out with us, to actually get me on the ballot by helping us petition if you're a resident of the district. But to also, what I'm laying out and what Mrs. LaRouche has made clear is that this has to be a part of a national debate. This is not just local politics here. This has to be a part of, the question of once and for all ending the partisan political warfare that is not addressing the real solutions has to be stopped. And we have a moment right now where the solutions are laid out very clearly. So we'll have a lot of fun here in this discussion with Joel. So I'm going to stop there. I will take questions after his presentation. If you have any additional questions on what we're doing further with the campaign, further on the platform, but I think this gives you a sense of what we need to be doing right now and why we have to do it with a sense of urgency if we're going to win this fight for the nation and winning the fight for bringing about a true peace and through economic development. So let me just stop there and thank you very much. Oh, let's go this way. We move this. We move it. Yeah. Yeah. Right. Turn back around. Away. Keep going. Yeah. Yeah, there you go.
So, real obstacle course.
Right.
So I did see Putin last night.
Yeah, you did.
Yeah, he said he didn't do it. But he was interviewed, as Kesha mentioned, by Megyn Kelly on NBC. He was broadcast last night. And it was a little bit like a waterboarding interview. But Putin came out of it all right. But before I go into Putin's speech from last week, I want to go back to 1972, which was the year that we signed the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty with Russia, or the USSR at the time. And that treaty came out of what had occurred 10 years previous to that, namely the Cuban Missile Crisis, where it's now coming out in more detail how close we came to total annihilation in that month of October. And if it wasn't for Kennedy and his collaboration with Khrushchev, we wouldn't be here today. So the ABM treaty was to limit each side to one anti-ballistic missile site. And the Russians chose to put their site around the capital, Moscow, and the U.S. put their site in North Dakota. Now, it wasn't to protect the farmers out there. It was to protect the Minuteman missile battery in North Dakota. So you see where our priorities were. Yeah. Now, the treaty, the anti-ballistic missile treaty, was inherently unstable because the assumption that we would continue the bad doctrine was embedded in that treaty. Now, I'm sure most of you know the bad doctrine is not just from Kissinger, it's the mutual assured destruction. And it's been compared to having two guys with AR-15 in a room pointing at each other, and the room is full of gasoline. And you're hoping that nobody strikes a match or has an itchy finger. Now, in 1982, with LaRouche's urging and collaboration with Dr. Edward Teller, Reagan, looking at what LaRouche had proposed around a defense, a strategic defense, instead of assured destruction, Reagan in 1983 adopted what became known as the Strategic Defense Initiative, which the Russian leader at that time, Andropov, immediately said, yet. Now, LaRouche warned at the time that if the Russians rejected that offer from Reagan, that their economy would collapse in 5 years, and it did collapse in 6 years. And the Warsaw Pact was dissolved, the Berlin Wall came down. And at that time, U.S. leaders promised to Gorbachev that the U.S. would not move NATO divisions close to the Russian border. Now, the first picture, can you put up that picture of Europe? Now, at the time, you had what was known as the Warsaw Pact. You had East Germany, you had thousands of Russian tanks in Eastern Europe. Now, once the agreement was made to pull the Russian armies out of Eastern Europe, what happened is you had thousands of men and equipment, tanks pulled back into Russia. And the president of Russia at the time, Yeltsin, was promised, and Yeltsin came after Gorbachev, that NATO would not occupy those Eastern European countries. Now, you have Poland and Romania highlighted with different colors. Do you have laser pointed? I think I did. Yeah. All right, if you can show that. Now, can you see where Iran is on that map?
It's not on that map. No.
All right. Well, the excuse, and in 2002, George W. Bush, and you have to remember this was a year after the 9/11 attack. And the first leader to call George W. Bush, after the attack was Putin. And Putin at the time immediately, and Bush was flying around Louisiana, Nebraska. And Cheney had told Bush, don't come back to Washington, D.C. We don't know if there's a general attack, so stay away from Washington. And Cheney proceeded to take care of things in Washington. Now Bush, looking at what happened in 9/11, declared that there was a new axis of evil in the world, which instead of including Saudi Arabia and Britain, which had organized the 9/11 attack, it included Iraq, Iran, and North Korea as a new axis of evil. And after going into Afghanistan, which we are still in, he proceeded to attack Iraq. Now, at the time in 2002, George Bush pulled the U.S. out of the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty. And the excuse given was that the threat was not from Russia, but the threat was from Iran and Korea. Now, if you were to defend yourself against a missile coming from Iran, where would you put your defensive missiles? Obviously, you'd put it in Poland. If you're going to shoot from Iran to Israel or to New York City, you're obviously going to go to Romania and Poland. So the Russians immediately at the time protested and said that you're going to destabilize the parity, the balance of terror. And this will destabilize things. But George Bush not only plowed into Iraq, which we are still in, but he not only pulled us out of the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, he proceeded to put anti-ballistic missile systems in Poland and Romania. And this policy was continued by Obama, and the missiles are now being activated in Poland. They're already active in Romania. Now, Putin in 2007 went to a defense conference in Munich, Germany, and repeated the warning that the abrogation of the ABM treaty was destabilizing the strategic situation. He said that the movement of NATO closer to Russia's borders was a threat, And the U.S. proceeded to completely ignore his warning. So last week, when Putin delivered his State of the Union address, he proceeded to lay out Russia's response to the last 16 years of aggression from not just the US, but from the whole NATO. And if you look at Eastern Europe, the whole Warsaw Pact disintegrated. There was no rationale for continuing NATO. And NATO is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. And you have to ask yourself, what part of the Atlantic does Afghanistan border? And we proceeded to invoke Article 5 of the NATO treaty, which says that any attack on one nation would be an attack on all and would be responded to. So Bush, after 9/11, said that this was an attack on the US, and we proceeded to get the NATO allies like Germany, Norway, and other nations to send troops to Afghanistan. Now, what Putin laid out last week, and I'll just go through a bit of the end of his speech. He said that the placement of these anti-ballistic missile systems so close to Russia's borders was not a response to Iran, not a response to Korea, because obviously if you're going to shoot something from Korea, you're not going to go through Poland or Romania. That this was a direct threat to Russia. And no matter what the verbal assurances were from the US, that what Russia had to look at was the capabilities and not the promises, verbal or otherwise. So he proceeded to lay out the response. Now, Uncle LaRouche has termed his speech last week the new Sputnik. And I want to go back to show you what the old Sputnik looked like. You put that's the cover of the EIR, right?
Right.
All right. Now, some of you may remember in October 4th of 1957, the world was shocked by the fact that it was Russia that was first to orbit a satellite around the Earth. And the arrogance of the US was that we were so far ahead of Russia in the realm of technology that we would be the first to orbit the satellite. Now, the good thing about Sputnik is it sparked a reaction in the US, which led to the development of NASA. It led to increase in technological training in the US. It actually sparked a good response. Now, we hope that this second Sputnik will elicit a similar response, not to increase our nuclear arsenal, but to increase our scientific collaboration with Russia and China. Now, I want to go through some of the weapons that Putin announced last week. And these have been in development for years, but now they're out in the open. So if you can show that first.
Wait a minute.
You got hacked?
Got hacked, yeah. Okay, there you go.
Okay, is that the avant-garde or the?
Yeah, that's the 20.
All right.
20.
Now, as LaRouche laid out when he proposed the SDI, that what you want for a defense is you want to use systems with new physical principles. Because if you're going to hit a missile traveling at thousands of miles an hour, hitting it with another missile is not the way to go, because the offense will always have the advantage that if you set up a defensive missile battery, the way to overwhelm it is to have more offensive missiles that would overwhelm the defense. But what the nuclear posture review indicated And what U.S. strategy has always been in the last 2 decades is that the purpose of these defensive missiles in Poland, Russia, and aboard a ship called the Aegis cruiser. Aegis is the Greek word for shield. It was Zeus's shield. And Aegis cruisers, we have about 80 around the world. And we have sent these cruisers not only into the Baltic, not only into the north, into the Arctic Circle, near the Russian bases, but we've sent these destroyers and cruisers right into the Black Sea. Now, these defensive missile batteries can also be launch tubes for cruise missiles. So if you have a ship in the Black Sea, I don't know, was the Black Sea in that other picture?
Well, no, it's not, but we'll get to it. We'll get to it.
But you remember where the Black, if you were to launch a cruise missile from the Black Sea, you can get to Moscow in about 10 minutes. So that Russia was being surrounded from its western borders. And if you look at the Pacific, Japan was being outfitted with these anti-ballistic missile systems. We just put a what's called the THAAD missile battery in Korea. And THAAD stands for Terminal High Altitude Area Defense. And if the North Koreans were to launch a missile to hit Seoul, Seoul is about 30 miles from the demilitarized zone. And if they were to launch a missile, they would not have to go 93 miles into space in order to hit Seoul. So what's the purpose of having a terminal high altitude area defense in Korea? It's to threaten China and Russia. And they have explicitly stated as much. So what Putin laid out last week is that the new missiles that Russia has developed will overwhelm any area of defense. Now, what the US has developed is this idea of prompt strike, which is another word for first strike. Because what they intend to do is if you launch a first strike and wipe out 90% of Russia's missiles in the silos, then any response could be handled by the defenses of these missile batteries in Poland, Romania, and in Japan, in Korea. So by deliberately placing these missiles so close to Russia, we have shortened the time for a launch from 30 minutes to about 3 to 6 minutes. So the world is up on a hair trigger. So what Putin proceeded to lay out is that the Russians have developed missile systems that could overwhelm any defensive missiles that the U.S. now has. So if you look at the first missile, that's what you have up there.
Right.
Yeah, oh God.
Right.
Now, the intercontinental ballistic missiles actually go into space. Now, they don't achieve orbital velocity, so that as they exit Earth's atmosphere, they immediately come back down at speeds of about 15,000 miles an hour. And you have multiple independently targeted reentry vehicles, so that one missile could deploy 10 to 15 individual warheads that can individually target, say, 10 or 15 cities or 10 or 15 sites in the target area. Now, if you know where the missile is launched and you know where the general direction where they're heading, you can program your defensive missile batteries to hit that window where these missiles, these warheads would be coming in. Now, what the Russians have done is they modified the warheads so that instead of coming down in a predictable trajectory, they're able to change their flight path on the way down. Now, the other missile that Putin announced last week, if you could show the next one.
Well, hold on, we haven't finished showing this. process here. This is the break.
All right.
Showing the maneuvering around the ships and radar systems. Okay, that's it for that one. Go on to the next one.
Yeah. If you could show the hypersonic.
Yeah, this is the hypersonic.
Now, also, the U.S. has about 14 aircraft carrier battle groups, which are used basically to pummel countries that have no defenses, like Iraq, possibly Iran, Korea, and also to threaten China and Russia itself. Now, since World War II, the aircraft carrier has been thought to be invincible because an aircraft carrier battle group has 15 ships, including cruisers, submarines for protection of the water. And up to now, it's been the key asset of the U.S. Navy. But if you have a missile that can fly at 5 times or greater the speed of sound, or over 4,500 miles an hour, you can fly faster than any missile on these cruisers. So you can evade these anti-ballistic missiles. And now the aircraft carrier is as vulnerable as the battleship was in World War II to airplane attack. So effectively, as of now, the aircraft carrier is a nice cruise ship. But as far as threatening to Russia, and China is working on similar missiles, effectively the aircraft carrier is now ready for retirement. Now, the hypersonic missile could be launched from a MiG-31, a Sukhoi 57. They have different launch aircraft. But because of the high speed, as I said, they can overwhelm any current defenses of these aircraft carriers and basically wipe them out. Now, does it show the flight path of one of these?
Yeah, it says.
Okay. So you see it would be launched by the fighter bomber. You would fly towards the target and then go vertical and then come right down, and the aircraft carrier would be literally a sitting duck. Now, the other major weapon that Putin announced is what's called the Sarmat missile. You have that one up.
Wait, we got the nuclear one first.
Oh, you got the cruise missile.
Right.
All right, yeah, this is the one that caused the most shock. Now, the U.S. was working on a nuclear-powered cruise missile back in late 50s, early 60s. And Kesha actually found a video of that. And if you're interested, I can send that to you. But the idea is that the cruise missile, which you've all probably seen coverage of the Tomahawk cruise missile as we pummeled Iraq, and recently, last year, as we pummeled an air base in Syria. Now, the cruise missile is like a flying drone with a jet on board and can deliver either a nuclear warhead or a high explosive in the 1 to 2 ton range. Now, what Putin announced last week was that they have developed a miniaturized atomic fission reactor. Now, I have not seen the specifications on that, but just from what Putin laid out in the speech, he said that the nuclear reactor is miniaturized. Now, it had to fit into about a 20-inch diameter missile. And it'd be a high temperature reactor that's either cooled by sodium or some kind of gas. And what the cruise missile does is it has an intake at the front, takes the air in. Air is heated to over 2,000 degrees by the atomic reactor. And the heated air is used as a propellant. And because of the energy density of the nuclear reactor, this cruise missile could fly around the world 5 or 6 times. So its range is virtually unlimited. And this would be a low altitude strike cruise missile. It has internal guidance. It does a terrain following radar where it has the terrain that it would be flying over in its computer, and it would fly over and into the valleys and reach its target once it had been launched. Now, obviously, if the Russians have miniaturized a reactor, they've made some major increases in their shielding, in their ceramic material processes, so that they can contain the reactor without melting the cruise missile before it even gets off the ground. So this is a major development, which would be a step towards using nuclear power in space, and eventually the fission reactor could be replaced by a fusion reactor. And we could use this for interplanetary travel, not just for destroying other cities. So this was ridiculed by US media coverage, saying that this thing would spew radiation all over its flight path. Well, obviously, the Russians have made some major developments in containing not only the heat, but the radiation from the small package reactor, so that this could be a major development, or like I said, for space travel. Now, you go to the next one. I think that's the Sarbot.
Right, yeah.
Now, this is their most massive missile. It's called the Sarbot. I tried to look up what that meant in Russian, but I think it's for salvation or something like that. But it replaces their heavy missile called the SS-18. Now, NATO has designated this the Satan II. Now, this is a heavy lift liquid fuel rocket, which has a capacity to have 10 to 15 warheads that are independently targeted once they're released. Now, each warhead has the explosive power of 10 to 15 Hiroshima bombs. So when you hear talk of a low yield nuclear device, what they mean is a low yield is a Hiroshima type bomb. So if you think Hiroshima was low yield, and that's what they're talking about. But these warheads are 10 times to 15 times more powerful than the Hiroshima bomb. And each missile can carry 10 to 15. These are the equivalent to the US Trident missile, which can carry 6 to 8 warheads independently targeted. Now, again, this one, once it reaches outside of Earth's atmosphere, it does not have the speed to do a full orbit. It reaches about 15,000 miles an hour, about 20 times the speed of sound. And when the warheads are coming back to Earth, again, they can be maneuvered because they have a maneuver capability to evade any defensive missiles coming at them. So I don't think this one shows the evasive maneuvers.
Well, it shows it has range to go through the South Pole instead of the North Pole.
Oh, yeah. This is the one that most of our defenses, including NORAD, the North American Air Defense System. And I'm sure you've all heard of NORAD, because NORAD is the group that tracks Santa Claus when he is coming every Christmas to deliver the goods. And NORAD keeps track of them. And there's a funny story behind it. But so all of our radars and all of our defenses are facing the north, because previously it was thought that the shortest route from Russia to the US is over the North Pole, over the Arctic. So now this missile can not only go over the North Pole, the Sarmat can be targeted to fly over the South Pole and come and hit us from behind. Now, obviously, there are defenses. There's no such thing as a ultimate weapon. Obviously, instead of building the wall to protect us from Mexico, we can build a new series of radar sites in the southern border. But what's the purpose of just counteracting these tit for tat? We would have to develop thousands of more anti-ballistic missile systems to match what the Russians have just laid out last week. So it would be better as a reaction to this, not to say that we're going to increase the nuclear buildup. And back in Obama's time, Obama had already forecast that we're going to spend $1 trillion over the next 30 years to rebuild or modernize our nuclear forces. Now, to deal with this new development, we could spend another $1 trillion. Now, if you look at these, eventually a few more trillion, and you're talking about some real bucks here. Now, the other way is that Putin also announced that Russia has developed new laser systems. Now, as was pointed out last week, well, you have all these high-speed warheads maneuvering and coming at us from all angles. Well, they can be knocked out by lasers at the speed of light. Well, yeah, that was the idea of LaRouche's Strategic Defense Initiative. But last 30 years, instead of developing beam weapons and high-powered lasers, we've put all our money in these high-speed missiles. So we've been spending all this money on radar systems, on high-speed missiles to deal with hitting a warhead with another warhead, instead of developing these new physical principles that Putin indicated is what Russia is heading towards just last week. Now, not only are they developing new ballistic missiles and cruise missiles, they're also developing undersea weapons. The undersea torpedo drone that Putin announced. And can you put that? Now, this one is also supposed to be nuclear powered. The small, compact nuclear generator, again, a fission reactor, probably in the 1 megawatt range, would be used to either turn the propellers or provide a water jet for high-speed torpedoes that can be armed with a nuclear warhead that can dive at depths way beyond any submarine and can pop up either underneath an aircraft carrier battle group, which if it's not hit by a hypersonic missile from the top down, it could be hit by a nuclear torpedo on the bottom up. And it can also be used to target ports and other coastal fortifications. Now, instead of countering this with more and more missiles and more refinement of what already exists, we should be sitting down with Putin, sitting down with the Chinese. If we can sit down with Kim Jong-un, there's no reason why Trump can't sit down with Putin. He's already met with Xi. We could be working out a new cooperative agreements to develop a real defense against missiles that would be shared by first the three major powers, and then developed to protect the Earth from asteroids and comets. Because if you look at the real threat to not only the U.S., but to the world. If you look at the damage that a asteroid the size of, say, Mount Everest, 6 miles, would do, that's what wiped out the dinosaurs. And if you look at the energy released by an asteroid actually hitting the Earth, it's the equivalent of trillions of tons of TNT. So if you were to put all the world's nuclear warheads together, one asteroid would have more energy release than all of the nuclear warheads in Russia and China, in Korea and the US arsenal combined. So the way to deal with that threat is to have the capability of high-speed travel throughout the solar system. So what Putin laid out last week is to say that what the US has spent its money on the last 30 years is now worthless, that our response could be either a massive buildup in missiles, which was the reaction of Antropov to the offer of the SDI from Reagan, which led to the economic collapse of the Soviet Union. Or we could say that this is a chance for us to reevaluate our nuclear posture and come to agreement with Russia and China and Korea, North Korea, Iran, these so-called rogue nations, and actually collaborate to use this type of technology, not for destruction, but for development, both on Earth and in space. So I think that's all the slides, right?
That's it, the slides, right?
All right, yeah. And I have a short video of infrared system that I worked on back in the 80s, but I'll wait and show that later. But
we can try to show it if you like. It'll take me a minute to set it up.
All right. So while he's setting it up, I'll open it up for questions either for me or
Joe,
Kesha.
just on the final point you made, I think that I didn't bring it up in the earlier briefing, but it just makes the point of how to address, the response that came from members of Congress. I don't know if people heard about this, but there were 4 senators, Democratic senators, who actually wrote a letter to Tillerson and to the Secretary of State, and were calling on the U.S. to sit down at the table with Russia. But trying to see, it was a letter to Tillerson. It actually came out from U.S. Senators Markey, Merkley, Dianne Feinstein, and Bernie Sanders. Anyway, they stated that a U.S.-Russia strategic dialogue is more urgent following President Putin's public address on March 1st, when he referred to several new nuclear weapons Russia is reportedly developing, including a cruise missile and a nuclear underwater drone, which you just went through, which are not currently limited by the New START treaty and would be destabilizing if deployed. So, basically they're indicating that Russia is violating the INF treaty and by making these developments. But I think, as said, this, what the United States has been doing for the past 30 years has now become rendered obsolete. And the question is, what's going to be the response in terms of, as you just said, bringing forth cooperation to the table? But I mean, I think this is interesting. This response is the way we're responding to it, in terms of that you have to look at this as an opportunity to work together to actually defend off these common threats, but not to see it as, this is a violation of treaty agreements. But anyway, if you had something you wanted to say.
Well, yeah, it was interesting. This intermediate nuclear force treaty was actually signed by Reagan and Gorbachev in 1987. And it involved missiles that were put into Europe by the NATO, basically the U.S. And the excuse was that the Russians had these intermediate range missiles that could hit anywhere in Europe. So our response in the early 80s was to put Pershing 2 missiles and cruise missiles in Germany. And there were all sorts of protests against it, because the idea was that the US would not sacrifice New York City to save Paris or West Berlin. So how do you deal with that? Well, put the missiles in Europe. Now, the problem was that a Pershing 2 intermediate range missile fired from anywhere in Western Europe could hit Moscow or anywhere in the western part of Russia in a matter of minutes. And cruise missiles would take a little longer. So that by placing these missiles in Europe, we again shortened the response time to a few minutes. Now, Reagan and Gorbachev made an agreement to pull out those intermediate range missiles. Now, intermediate range missile is considered about 3,000 mile range. So the systems announced by Putin are not covered by that treaty because they cover much more than 3,000 mile range. So Russia has not violated the Intermediate Force Treaty. The U.S. abrogated the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty. Russia, as of now, is still honoring the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, or the START Treaty. So nothing that Putin announced is in violation of any treaty. But again, the response is not just to make another arms treaty, but to have cooperative agreements so that we can develop jointly the technology to make any nuclear missile impotent and obsolete. So that would be the best defense. And just to give you a comparison, I forgot to mention that if you take the muzzle speed of an AR-15, which has been in the news lately, is 2,000 miles an hour. Now, for those who think that the purpose of the Second Amendment was so that we could defend ourselves against the government or against even a foreign threat, what's an AR-15 going to do against a missile or warhead that can fly 20 times the speed of sound? So again, the solution is not more arms, but to push the new physical principles so that we can safely decommission these weapons of mass destruction. And as was done partially after the Berlin Wall came down, we could have a megatons to megawatts program to turn from destruction into actually something useful. So the fact that these Democratic senators are urging talks with Russia is a marked improvement over what they've been urging over the last year and a half.
Sergey had a question.
Yeah. What's your opinion why Putin released all this information just before 2 weeks before election? Why he give all this information openly just 2 weeks before and waiting for almost 11 years after his Munich speech? Because all these missiles cannot be developed in 1 year, in 2 years. It's a long-term program. What's your feeling? Are they something,
Well, these programs have been in development for the last 14, 15 years.
Yeah.
Now, I could say that he wanted to release this so that in case the U.S. interfered in the Russian elections,
As we've been known to do.
but it's this idea of I don't know if you ever saw Dr. Strangelove, the movie, Dr. Strangelove, where the Russians in that movie, and it was very realistic. If you haven't seen it, I recommend it. But the Russians in that movie developed what's known as the doomsday machine. And the lead scientific designer for the U.S. side is this old German called Dr. Strangelove. And he's hearing this new weapon that the Russians have designed called a doomsday, so that if we were to decapitate the Russian leadership, that just the fact that our hitting Russia would detonate automatically a device that would detonate and essentially render the planet inhabitable automatically. And the Dr. Strangelove is hearing this from the Russian ambassador who's in the war room. And he says, well, this is very interesting. We were thinking of developing a similar weapon, but the idea of a doomsday device is not to keep it secret. It's to let the other side know that you have this weapon. And then the Russians said, well, we were going to announce this in our party day the next week. But the idea of announcing this is to say to the West that your fantasy about total domination is over, that we have developed a counter to your strategy. And because we've developed this, he chose to announce it now because it's ready for deployment. The last test of the Sarmat missile was in December. And they have been flight testing this cruise missile for the last year or so. So he announced it now. I don't think it has much to do with the election because I think according to the latest polls, Putin's going to win. But
unless there's interference.
Unless the NSA has hacked their computers.
Hillary Clinton wins.
But I think his announcement was a warning to the West because he was hoping for a relationship with Trump, but he realizes that Trump, no matter what he intended to do in a good relation with Russia, has been tied down by this witch hunt against him and is virtually held hostage. So that Putin, knowing that that was the case, decided to announce this now to shock the Americans into realizing that they have to change.
It's also, Joel, it's one in the eye for the Western intelligence services who were caught completely flat-footed by these announcements and had no idea of the Russian capabilities. I mean, if he left it up to them, we would still not know about it for another couple of decades. Yeah. They're so busy looking for what doesn't exist in President Trump's case.
We'd know where all the Russian spies are hiding under the bed.
Joel?
Yes.
Yeah, this is Brian. Going back to the science involved and some of the new physical principles. Kind of pulling a few threads, a few things together. You have, in Putin's speech, he talked about these, I think he called them wings, but gliders at Mach 20 that traveled in a generated plasma field but remain completely maneuverable. And otherwise, tying another thread into this, the scramjet technology that you were discussing. China is also, in February, they launched a prototype into space, and then returned it to Earth. It landed. This was in February. So it seems that we're on the verge of developing. I'm not the first person to say this, but it seems like it's very significant that we're on the verge. Mankind's on the verge of developing capability to take off from the ground with a plane. Not that we're quite there yet, but we're close to it, and go into space and return a crew safely. You know, I think that's where this plasma envelope, the development of maneuverability within a plasma envelope comes into play, in part. So I just wondered if you had something more to, some thoughts on that, further thoughts on that.
Yeah, if you remember when the Apollo command modules were coming back to Earth after reaching the moon, and Kennedy went through this a little bit in his Rice speech, is that the command capsule is coming back to the atmosphere at 25,000 miles an hour. And it has to hit the atmosphere at the right angle, because if it's too short an angle, it'll skip off into space. If it's too steep an angle, it will be so hot that it would burn through the heat shield of the command module. But all of them came in at the right angle. But for the first few minutes, we lost radio contact, because as the command module comes through the atmosphere, it heats up and it forms a plasma around the capsule so that the radio waves could not go through the plasma. What I think Putin was talking about is that any warhead that comes back through the atmosphere, even though it's not coming back from the moon at 25,000 miles an hour, but it's coming back down at 15,000 miles an hour, it's going to generate a plasma regardless. But they have developed maneuvering systems so that the warhead coming back is not limited to just going through that plasma phase, but is able to maneuver at high altitude. And I would imagine it's maneuvering with gyroscopes and accelerometers, not so much with the winglets. Those are for when it reaches a lower altitude. But it also indicates that they have developed higher temperature ceramics so that they can not just come back to the atmosphere, but can maneuver at high altitudes while it's still in this plasma reentry phase. As far as the Chinese, I mean, this is an indication of what we should have been doing to replace the shuttle. Instead of allowing Elon Musk to take all this glory of doing what we did 50 years ago. Mm-hmm. And the only thing new was they returned back to Earth, but the shuttle returned back to Earth. And if we could develop this space plane, then the cost of getting into low Earth orbit would be much cheaper than anything that Elon Musk is working on. So the fact that the Chinese are developing this system is an indication that we should eliminate this ban on working with China for fear of them stealing our technology, as they obviously stole our high-speed train technology.
You're right.
But we should work with them to see that their breakthroughs can be matched with what we have as a reserve, a technological reserve. Bring some of these NASA engineers out of retirement and actually implement some of the plans that were in the works for a real replacement of the shuttle not with some old rockets, but with these new space planes.
And a nuclear powered system.
Yeah, a shuttle with nuclear power could just take off from the Earth and go up there in orbit and dump stuff off and even go all the way to the moon.
Yeah, now, I'm not sure what the thrust of this cruise missile is. We would still probably be dependent on chemical rockets to get to low Earth orbit. But once we're in orbit, then we can use these nuclear rockets, either go back and forth to the moon or eventually with the fusion rockets to get to Mars.
2 weeks.
Or less. Yeah.
Did you have a question, Dave? Did you?
Now, while you're thinking of other questions, Mike, you have that.
Okay, but I gotta silence you for a second.
I'm on mute. this was a system that was developed to take out Russian tanks. And eventually it was used to blow up Iraq, Libya, and all these countries that had no real defense against these laser-guided missiles.
What did you do in that project, Joel?
I designed a motherboard for that system.
Wow.
And so we would go as a team to. They wouldn't let me fly the damn thing, but we'd go there and make sure everything worked. And I had to take care of the power supply too. And one time there was a component failed, and we had to go to Radio Shack to get a component to repair it.
They don't have Radio Shacks with components.
Yeah, now,
No.
but now those have been replaced by cruise missiles and drones.
So why were we looking at that, Joel?
Just to show you what the infrared system, because these kill missiles, what they use is they're launched with radar guidance, and once they come close to the target warhead, then they use an infrared system. Because the warhead coming back at thousands of degrees is very bright compared to the dark space. So the infrared system homes in on the target. And the missile actually just hits it with not a warhead, but just a kinetic impact. But
Thank you, Joel.
So I have a couple of announcements we can make offline here. Yes.